The mess hall at Camp Pendleton fell silent in that particular way that makes everyone's skin prickle. The kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation, though no one could have predicted which. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Cowery stood at the coffee station, her hands steady despite the scalding liquid that had just splashed across her uniform blouse. The Marine corporal who'd shoved past her was already 3 steps away, laughing with his buddies about fucking Navy personnel taking up space in a Marine facility. She didn't turn. Didn't need to. 22 years of service had taught her that some battles weren't worth the ammunition, and some revelations carried more weight when they arrived on their own timeline. But the corporal's friend, a sergeant with more experience and considerably better instincts, had gone pale. He was staring at the insignia on Nadia's collar, then at the unit patch on her shoulder that most people didn't recognize because most people never got close enough to DEVGRU operations to know what they were looking at. His hand shot out, gripping the corporal's arm hard enough to stop him mid-stride. The thing about Naval Special Warfare Command is that it doesn't announce itself. The officers who coordinate SEAL team operations don't wear their authority like parade dress. They wear it like a second skin, invisible until circumstances demand otherwise. Nadia had spent the last 8 years in that particular shadow world, the one where decisions made in climate-controlled rooms determined whether men came home in body bags or under their own power. She'd flown combat missions in 3 different theaters before transitioning to command coordination. Her call sign widow had nothing to do with marital status and everything to do with her particular talent for bringing everyone home except the enemy. The sergeant was whispering now, urgent and low. The corporal's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror. Around them, the mess hall remained frozen, 50 pairs of eyes tracking this small drama with the intensity of people who understood they were watching someone step on a landmine in slow motion. Nadia finished pouring her coffee. Added cream. No sugar. She'd given up sugar in 2019 during her last deployment to the Persian Gulf, and the habit had stuck. Small disciplines in a life built on larger ones. When she finally turned, her expression was neither angry nor amused. It was something far more dangerous patient. The corporal was standing at attention now, his face flushed red enough to suggest either imminent cardiac arrest or the belated arrival of common sense. The morning light through the mess hall windows caught the dust motes floating in still air. Someone's radio crackled softly from a nearby table, something about training exercises scheduled for 0900. Normal sounds of a normal day on a military installation, except nothing about this moment felt normal anymore. Nadia took a sip of her coffee. Let the silence stretch. She'd learned timing from her father, a Lebanese immigrant who'd flown F-14s in the 80s, and taught his daughter that authority wielded quietly carried 10 times the force of authority announced. The corporal's throat worked as he tried to formulate words, but Nadia spoke first, her voice carrying just far enough to reach him and not an inch farther. At ease, Marine. 2 words, 11 letters, the kind of command that didn't require volume to convey weight. The corporal's shoulders dropped fractionally, though his posture remained rigid. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere past Nadia's left shoulder, the classic position of someone who desperately wished to be anywhere else on Earth. The sergeant beside him had taken 2 steps back, creating physical distance from what was rapidly becoming a career-defining moment for his friend. Nadia let another beat of silence pass, then another. In the tactical world she inhabited, timing was everything, whether you were coordinating a hostage extraction or making a point about respect and awareness. "What's your name, Corporal?" "Corporal Marcus Webb, ma'am." His voice cracked slightly on the ma'am, and somewhere in the back of the mess hall, someone coughed to cover what might have been a laugh. Nadia nodded slowly, took another sip of coffee. The stain on her blouse was already setting in, a dark spreading bloom across the khaki fabric that would require salt water and patience to remove. She'd deal with it later. Right now, she was conducting a different kind of operation, the kind that didn't involve weapons or aircraft but could reshape a young Marine's entire understanding of the chain of command and the people who operated within it. Webb's service record would be clean, she already knew. You didn't make corporal in the Marines by being stupid or lazy. You made it by being good at your job and following orders. But you could still be young, and you could still make mistakes born of assumption rather than malice. "You know what I do here, Corporal Webb?" "No, ma'am." The admission came quick, honest, points for that at least. "I coordinate logistics and operational planning for special warfare units operating out of this facility and 3 others across the southwestern United States. When SEAL teams deploy, I'm one of the people who makes sure they have what they need when they need it where they need it. Air support, medical evacuation, intelligence updates, equipment requisitions, timeline adjustments when missions go sideways." She paused, watching his expression shift as the implications settled in. "Last month, I coordinated a real-time extraction of 8 SEALs from a compromised position in the Horn of Africa. The window was 14 minutes. We made it in 12. The mess hall had gone from silent to absolutely still. This was the kind of information that rarely traveled outside classified briefing rooms, and Nadia was fully aware she was walking a careful line between making a point and violating operational security. But nothing she'd said compromised active missions or revealed specific methodologies. She was simply painting a picture, helping young Corporal Webb understand the depth of the water he just jumped into without checking for rocks. "Before this assignment, I flew EA-18G Growlers. Before that, FA-18 Super Hornets. I have 4,200 hours of flight time, including 800 in combat zones. My call sign is Widow, which I earned after a mission in 2015 where my electronic warfare systems disabled enemy air defense long enough for an entire strike package to complete their objectives without a single aircraft hit." She shifted her coffee cup to her left hand. "I'm telling you this not because I need you to be impressed, Corporal. I'm telling you because you need to understand something fundamental about this facility and the people who work here." Webb's eyes had widened progressively with each sentence. Beside him, the sergeant looked like he wanted to physically melt into the floor. Around them, the mess hall population was now openly starring, the pretense of minding their own business completely abandoned. This was the kind of moment that would circulate through the base within hours, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, until eventually someone would claim Nadia had reprimanded Webb while simultaneously coordinating a drone strike via hand signals. Nadia stepped closer, not threatening, she didn't need to threaten, just close enough that Webb couldn't avoid meeting her eyes. "Every person on this base has a job. Some of those jobs are obvious, some aren't. But all of them matter, and all of them deserve respect until proven otherwise. You saw someone in a Navy uniform and made an assumption. That assumption led you to disrespect not just me personally, but the entire apparatus of naval aviation and special operations coordination that keeps Marines alive when they're downrange. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was steadier now, the initial shock giving way to something that looked like genuine understanding. "I apologize for my conduct. It was unprofessional and inexcusable." "It was," Nadia agreed. "But you're young and you're going to make mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them." She finished her coffee in one long swallow, then held out the empty cup. "You're going to take this to the washing station. Then you're going to come find me at Building 74 at 1300 hours. We're going to have a longer conversation about operational integration and why inter-service respect isn't just good manners, it's mission critical." "Understood." Webb took the cup like it was a live grenade. "Yes, ma'am, understood." Nadia turned without waiting for further response and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted naturally, people stepping back to create a path. She could feel their eyes on her back, could almost hear the conversations that would start the moment she cleared the door. That was fine. Let them talk. The story would spread, and maybe a few more young service members would think twice before making assumptions based on uniform color or gender or any of the other superficial markers that people used to categorize each other. As she pushed through the door into the bright California morning, she allowed herself the smallest smile. The stain on her blouse had already stopped bothering her. She had 12 minutes before her next meeting with the DEVGRU commanding officer, plenty of time to swing by her quarters and change. Behind her, the mess hall exploded into conversation. The walk to Building 74 took 11 minutes at a measured pace. Nadia used the time to mentally shift gears, filing the mess hall incident away in the category of teaching moments and focusing, instead on the afternoon's actual priorities. The DEVGRU commander, Captain Marcus Reeves, wanted to discuss upcoming deployment rotations and the logistical nightmare of coordinating equipment shipments to 3 different forward operating bases, without alerting anyone who might be paying attention to increased naval activity in certain regions. It was the kind of puzzle Nadia had learned to love: infinitely complex, critically important, and almost invisible to anyone outside the immediate operation. Building 74 sat near the perimeter of the base, deliberately nondescript in the way that truly important facilities always were. No signage, no flags, just a number stenciled near the door and a security checkpoint that looked casual but wasn't. The Marine on duty, a staff sergeant named Patel, who'd been doing this job for 3 years, nodded as Nadia approached. No salute. They didn't salute at this facility. Too much potential for identifying officers to anyone who might be watching from a distance. Morning, Commander. Captain Reeves is in conference room 2 with Lieutenant Barnes. Thanks, Patel. Nadia scanned her badge, waited for the double beep that indicated clearance, and pushed through the security door into the cool interior. The building's climate control was set to 68 degrees year-round, a necessity given the amount of computer equipment humming in various offices and workspaces. The walls were standard military beige, decorated with nothing except the occasional fire evacuation map. This wasn't a place designed for comfort or aesthetics. It was designed for function, and it functioned exceptionally well. Conference Room 2 was halfway down the main corridor, behind another security door that required both badge scan and PIN entry. Nadia punched in her code from memory. She'd been doing it daily for 4 years, and stepped into a room that contained precisely 5 people, and enough classified information to cause genuine international incidents if it ever leaked. Captain Reeves looked up from a tablet display showing what Nadia recognized as satellite imagery of somewhere in the Middle East. Lieutenant Barnes, the operations planning officer, was making notes on a whiteboard covered in timelines and logistics matrices. Both men nodded as she entered. Commander Cowery, how was your morning? Reeves asked the question with the kind of tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Base gossip traveled fast, especially when it involved public confrontations in the mess hall. Educational, Nadia replied, taking her seat at the conference table. For everyone involved. Reeves smiled slightly. I heard. Webb's platoon sergeant has already submitted a request for the corporal to receive additional training on inter-service protocols. I approved it. Good. Nadia pulled out her own tablet, syncing it with the room's display system. What are we looking at? Barnes stepped away from the whiteboard. Potential deployment window opening up in 8 days. The timeline's tight because of weather patterns in the target region. We've got a SEAL team on standby, but the logistics are complicated by the fact that our primary air support asset is currently undergoing maintenance in Bahrain. Nadia studied the satellite imagery, her mind already running through contingency options. The target region. She didn't need to ask which one. The geography was distinctive enough, had exactly 2 viable approach corridors for rotary-wing aircraft, both of which were monitored by at least 3 different intelligence services. Getting in wasn't impossible, but getting in quietly required the kind of planning that made chess look like checkers. She pulled up a separate data layer on her tablet, overlaying flight time calculations and fuel range parameters. What's the maintenance timeline in Bahrain? Optimistically, 6 days. Realistically, Barnes shrugged, could be 10. So we need a backup. Nadia's fingers moved across her tablet screen, pulling up asset inventories for 3 different bases. We've got 2 MH-60s at Djibouti that are mission-ready. Transit time would be approximately 14 hours with 1 refueling stop. If we position them now, they'd be in theater with 2 days to spare. Reeves leaned back in his chair, considering. What about crew availability? Night Stalkers out of the 160th. I can have them airborne within 18 hours of confirmation. Nadia was already drafting the request message in her head, calculating which commanding officer she needed to contact and what leverage she had available to expedite the approval process. This was the hidden architecture of military operations, not the dramatic helicopter insertions or the gunfights, but the endless phone calls and logistics calculations that made those moments possible. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, diving deep into equipment manifests and communication protocols, and the 1,000 small details that separated successful operations from disasters. Nadia had learned early in her career that people who dreamed of military glory rarely understood that glory was built on a foundation of paperwork, planning, and the unglamorous work of making sure everyone had the right equipment at the right time. She'd made her peace with that reality years ago, back when she was still flying combat missions, and realized that the most important moments of her deployments weren't the ones where she was pulling GS in a fighter jet, but the quiet hours of mission planning that happened before the engines ever started. By the time the meeting concluded, Nadia had a clear action plan and approximately 6 hours to execute it before the day's second round of meetings began. She headed back to her office, a small space that contained a desk, 2 chairs, 3 computer monitors, and absolutely no personal decoration except a single photograph on the corner of her desk. The photo showed a younger version of herself standing beside an FA-18, her helmet tucked under one arm and the biggest smile on her face. That had been 2011, her first deployment to the Persian Gulf. She'd been 28 years old and convinced she was invincible. 14 years and considerable experience had tempered that conviction, but the fundamental love of the work remained unchanged. Her computer pinged with an incoming message. Colonel Sarah Winters, who ran logistics coordination for Marine Special Operations. The message was characteristically brief. Heard about Webb. Well handled. Drinks later. Nadia smiled and typed back an equally brief confirmation. Winters was one of the few people on base who operated at her level, not in terms of rank, but in terms of the kind of work that never appeared in official histories, but determined whether missions succeeded or failed. They developed a professional friendship over the years, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that came from doing impossible jobs competently. The rest of the afternoon blurred into the familiar rhythm of email responses, phone calls, and the delicate political navigation required when coordinating operations across multiple commands. Nadia spoke with a Navy supply officer in San Diego, a logistics coordinator in Bahrain, and an Air Force colonel who controlled transport assets at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Each conversation required a slightly different approach. The supply officer responded best to direct requests backed by regulation citations. The logistics coordinator preferred collaborative problem-solving, and the Air Force colonel needed to feel like he was making the decision rather than being told what to do. Nadia had spent years learning these subtle variations, understanding that effective coordination was as much about psychology as it was about spreadsheets. At precisely 1300 hours, her office phone rang. The security desk downstairs. Corporal Webb had arrived for their meeting. Nadia told them to send him up, then took a moment to arrange her thoughts. This wasn't a formal reprimand, that wasn't her style, and more importantly, it wasn't effective. Webb had already been embarrassed in front of his peers, which served its own educational purpose. What he needed now was context, understanding of why inter-service cooperation mattered beyond abstract concepts of military professionalism. She pulled up a specific file on her computer, one that she kept for exactly these kinds of conversations. Webb knocked precisely 3 times. Nadia called for him to enter, and he stepped through the door with the careful precision of someone acutely aware they were still on thin ice. His uniform was immaculate now, and his posture suggested he'd spent the last several hours contemplating his life choices. Nadia gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat, hands on his knees, eyes forward, the very picture of a disciplined Marine who'd learned an important lesson. "Relax, Corporal, this isn't a court-martial." Nadia's voice carried just enough warmth to break through his rigid formality. "Tell me about your MOS." Webb blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I'm 0311, ma'am, rifleman, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." "Good unit. They were at Fallujah in '04, right?" "Yes, ma'am. The battalion has a distinguished history." Pride crept into his voice, the kind that came from being part of something larger than yourself. "They do," Nadia agreed. "And that history exists because thousands of Marines have done their jobs competently over decades. But here's what I want you to understand, and why I asked you to come here instead of just letting this morning's incident fade into base gossip." She turned her monitor so he could see the screen. It displayed a mission report from 2018, sanitized of the most sensitive details but still clearly marked classified. "This is a SEAL team operation that went wrong. Equipment failure, compromised position, the works. They called for emergency extraction under fire." Webb's eyes scanned the report, and Nadia watched his expression shift as he absorbed the details. The extraction team got them out. All 8 SEALs survived. They survived because 4 different service branches coordinated flawlessly under pressure. Navy Command approved the extraction. Air Force provided refueling support for the helicopters. Army Aviation flew the actual mission because they had assets closer to the target zone. And the Marines, Nadia pointed to a specific paragraph. Marines provided covering fire and secured the landing zone, allowing the helicopters to land safely. That's 23 people from 4 services, all doing their jobs perfectly, all trusting each other implicitly. That's why inter-service respect matters, Corporal. Not because of some abstract ideal, but because lives depend on it. Webb read the paragraph she'd indicated, then looked up. His expression had shifted from nervous contrition to something deeper, genuine understanding of the larger system he was part of. "I never thought about it like that, ma'am." People don't until something forces them to. That's not a criticism, it's reality. We train in our silos, we work in our silos, and we develop tribal loyalties to our specific service. That's natural, but it can't be absolute because modern warfare requires integration. Nadia closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "You're a good Marine, Webb. Your record shows that. But good Marines can still make mistakes, and the measure of a good Marine is what happens after the mistake. Do they defend it, justify it, minimize it? Or do they learn from it and become better?" "I want to learn from it, ma'am." Webb's voice was steady now, the nervousness replaced by determination. "What do I need to do?" Nadia had prepared for this question. She pulled a folder from her desk drawer and slid it across to him. "This is information about an inter-service training exercise happening next month. It's voluntary, but I'm recommending you volunteer. You'll be working alongside Navy, Air Force, and Army personnel on a simulated crisis response scenario. It'll be 3 days of intensive training, and it'll give you first-hand experience with how other services operate. Are you interested?" Webb opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. "Yes, ma'am, definitely." "Good. Get it approved through your chain of command and report back to me with confirmation." Dismissed. Webb stood, snapped to attention, and delivered the crispest salute Nadia had seen in months. She returned it, watching as he left the office with considerably more confidence than he'd entered. The door clicked shut, and Nadia returned her attention to her computer monitors. The afternoon's work wasn't finished, not by several hours, but she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Webb would be fine. He'd learn, grow, and probably tell the story about today for years to come. Maybe he'd even become one of those senior enlisted leaders who made a point of teaching younger service members about the importance of respect and integration. That would be a good outcome, the kind that rippled forward through time and influence in ways that couldn't be measured but mattered deeply. The sun was setting by the time Nadia finished her last call and locked her computer. She grabbed her jacket from the back of her chair and headed out, nodding to the evening security crew as she left Building 74. The base had that particular quality that military installations always had at dusk, half lit by street lamps, populated by people transitioning from day duty to night duty, quiet but not silent. Nadia had spent so much of her adult life on bases like this that the atmosphere felt more like home than any civilian environment ever had. Maybe that was sad, or maybe it was just the natural result of choosing a profession that demanded total commitment. She'd stopped questioning it years ago. Colonel Winters was waiting at the officers' club, a facility that was marginally nicer than the enlisted mess hall but still fundamentally military in its aesthetic sensibilities. She'd claimed a table near the back, away from the main crowd, and had already ordered 2 beers. Nadia slid into the seat across from her and accepted the offered bottle with a nod of thanks. For several minutes, they drank in companionable silence. Winters was one of the few people who understood that silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, it was just space to breathe. Webb looked properly terrified when I saw him this afternoon, Winters finally said. You put the fear of God into that kid. He needed it, but he's got potential. I sent him to the inter-service exercise next month. Nadia took a long drink. The beer was cheap and cold, exactly what the moment required. How was your day? The usual chaos. Equipment delays, personnel shortages, and everyone wondering why things can't happen faster. Winters smiled without humor. Sometimes I miss flying. At least in the cockpit, the problems are immediate and the solutions are clear. You don't miss it nearly as much as you think you do, Nadia replied. You'd be bored out of your mind within a week. Probably, Winters conceded. But it's a nice fantasy. Speaking of fantasies, I heard you're coordinating that deployment Window Barnes was talking about, the 8-day thing. Nadia raised an eyebrow. That's classified. Everything interesting is classified. I have clearance. Talk to me. They spent the next hour discussing the logistics challenges of the upcoming deployment, trading ideas and solutions with the ease of professionals who'd been doing this work long enough to anticipate problems before they materialized. Other officers drifted past their table, some nodding in greeting, others too absorbed in their own conversations to notice. The club gradually filled with the evening crowd, people decompressing after long days, people celebrating promotions or successful training exercises, people just trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the highly structured environment of military life. Nadia finished her second beer and checked her watch. 2100 hours. Early by most standards, but she had a meeting at 0630 tomorrow morning and needed at least 6 hours of sleep to function optimally. She said goodbye to Winters and walked back to her quarters, a small apartment in the officers' housing complex that contained exactly as much personality as she'd bothered to inject into it. Which was to say, very little. A bed, a couch, a television that she rarely watched, and a kitchen that she used primarily for coffee preparation. The walls were regulation white. The furniture was standard issue. The only personal touches were a handful of books stacked on the nightstand and the flight suit hanging in her closet, carefully maintained even though she hadn't worn it in anger for years. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind refusing to shut down despite her body's exhaustion. This was the curse of command-level work. The problems followed you home, circling endlessly in your thoughts, demanding attention even when attention couldn't solve them. Nadia had learned to manage it through discipline and routine, but some nights were harder than others. Tonight was one of those nights. She kept replaying the mess hall incident, not because she regretted her response, but because it had stirred up old memories. The times she'd been underestimated, dismissed, treated as less capable than her male peers despite identical qualifications. The slow, grinding process of proving herself over and over until the weight of evidence became undeniable. Her call sign widow had come from a mission early in her career, back when she was still fighting for respect rather than commanding it automatically. An electronic warfare sortie over hostile territory, her growler systematically shutting down enemy air defenses while strike aircraft completed their objectives behind her. The mission had been flawless. Every enemy radar system disabled, every threat neutralized, every friendly aircraft returned safely. One of the strike pilots had joked afterward that she'd left the enemy completely alone and helpless, like widows at a funeral. The call sign had stuck, though its meaning had evolved over time. Now it carried weight beyond its original context, a reputation for competence, precision, and the kind of quiet lethality that came from expertise rather than aggression. Nadia eventually slept, her dreams populated by the familiar imagery of flight clouds and horizons, and the endless expanse of sky that had defined so much of her adult identity. She woke at 0500 to her alarm, showered, dressed in fresh utilities, and headed to Building 74 for another day of work that would never appear in headlines but would quietly determine whether missions succeeded and people lived. This was her world now, and she'd made peace with it. The glory belonged to the operators on the ground and the pilots in the air. The satisfaction belonged to the people like her, the ones who made everything else possible.